Okay, welcome to part 4. In the last part we were covering deferred lighting, so this effect here, and we started off hardpointing with navigation lights. So we've created navigation lights on the nacelles for the port and starboard on the top and the bottom just by quickly making some changes in the hardpoint script with a text editor. So we're going to continue on with hardpointing by creating shields. We want the ship to have some shields. So if we go File, actually let's just close this file, or edit, excuse me, Hardpoint Properties, and right here we've got shield generators. Just click Add. There's nothing really special to do here. You don't have to set coordinates for it. Center point of the shields is centered on the center of the X and Y of the ship. So again, that's important to make sure your ship is centered. Otherwise your shields won't encompass the ship realistically. So shield gen 1, you can rename that if you want. That's not important. The color, again, the color picker is broken. You can pick a color, but it probably won't save it. Darker colors will show up, just barely show up. Shields are meant to be obviously translucent, so a lighter color will look nice. So you've got the charging rate, so how quickly the shields can regenerate, and the maximum charge, so how powerful are the shields when they're at 100%. The radius mod controls how large the shields are in comparison to the ship. Obviously we can't see anything right now because the shield color defaults to white, which is transparent. So just click Save, because trying to edit anything in here again is isn't going to work. So excuse me, the shield color defaults to black, so yeah, that's why it's transparent. So open up your Hardpoint Properties file in your text editor. So now at the bottom we should have a new entry called Shield Generator, and if you want you can rename it to whatever you'd like. And the maximum charge, we'll get to that in a minute, charge rate, but let's just focus on the color. So we want the color, obviously we know that Federation or Starfleet type shields are generally blue. So again, following the color scheme, their RGB color scheme, red, green, blue, we want blue to be pretty pronounced. So let's go 200 and let's say 30. But we know it's not just blue. If we just make it blue, it'll have a pretty intense, it'll just be a blue. So let's mix in a little bit of green, let's say 40, and we'll mix in a little bit of red, 20. So nothing extreme. So save. We need to reload the shuttle. Player ship, load, and then open up the Hardpoint editor in the program and just click on Shield Gen. And there's our shield. That's pretty close. You can tweak the colors if you want, add it, make it more blue, or add other colors to it to make whatever color you want. If you're making Romulan, obviously you want green shields. Klingon, you'd like to have red shielding, etc., etc. So there you can see it's loaded from our Hardpoint file the colors, and that's basically the only thing you need to really do in the text editor is modify the colors. The next thing we're going to do is the radius mod. So it's easier to manipulate the size of the shields if you can see them really well. So you want a fairly bright color at least to start with. So just expand the radius mod, and these coordinates aren't, they are X, Y, Z coordinates, but they expand out from the center. So the first number is our X, and that's the width. So as you can see, the width of the shield traversing across here like this from left to right is obviously way too big. So at 1, that's the size. We want, let's go 0.6. That's pretty close. As you can see, because our ship isn't centered, our ship is actually nudged a little bit to the left of center. So we're going to have a little bit more shield on the right hand side showing than on the left hand side. but that's pretty close. If we moved it in anymore, it would start to intersect the nacelle here. And the length is pretty close. Obviously, different ships have different shapes. It's sometimes very difficult to find a happy medium of center, because sometimes you have bits hanging out that you still want to encompass with the shield, which causes it to be extended here. So as you can see, because the ship isn't centered on the y-axis, it's actually a little bit too high. It should have been lowered before I exported it. So the shield, because it's going off the center point, and the center point we found was somewhere just above the nacelle. So as you can see, it's centered on that. So you've got an equal amount from there to there. So if this was perfectly centered, we could reduce the y. I'll do it anyways. So the y is 0.5. Let's make it 0.4. Hit enter, and you can see it shaved a little bit off, made it a little bit smaller. And the last one is the z coordinate. And again, because the way that the ship is designed, sometimes you're limited into exactly how conforming you can make the shield to the ship. And that looks like it's about as good as it's going to get, because otherwise we're going to cut off the nose of the ship. So that's pretty good. If you wanted to change that, again, just add a number. So if we went 1.2, it made it a little bit longer here, extended it beyond the nose. But let's take it back to just 1. So 1, enter, and we're done with the size of the shield. So you can click save. Okay, so we have shields, but they're totally ineffective. They're not going to afford you any protection. We need to change this number, so the maximum charge rate. I think the default for the Galaxy class that came with this was somewhere around 1200. So if you use that as a rule of thumb, obviously a little shuttle with a small power generation plant obviously can't generate a high intensity shield. So we'll scale this down. We'll say, let's give it 300. And the charging rate is how quickly the shield can recover. Obviously, a shuttlecraft doesn't have the power reserves to regenerate its shields very rapidly, and this is a very sensitive number. So 0 obviously is none. It has no regenerative capabilities, but we'd like to have it have, some. So the Galaxy class, I can't remember if it's the default or what I set it to, but is 0.1, and that has a about a 1% per maybe 5 seconds of regeneration. So if for every 5 seconds of time that passes that the shields aren't being drained, they will regenerate by 1%. So that's probably a little bit unrealistic for a shuttlecraft, so we're going to make the number a little bit smaller. So 0.05. We'll make it half that. So that should make it about every 10 seconds that the shields regenerate, you'll get 1% every 10 seconds. So save. And that's it. So that's it for shielding. So we now have shields. So as soon as you activate Red Alert, so down here our shields are now at 100%. So if we're attacked, we have a little bit more protection than just the hull. And that's one other thing we'll just do quickly. Hardpoint properties, physical attributes, and we're going to bump up the hull strength. And again, the hull strength, I think, on the Galaxy class is... actually, I think the hull strength is about 1200. The shield charge was, I think, about 2,000 or 3,000. So the physical attributes, the hull strength on this, let's make it 300 as well. Okay, and one quick thing to touch on here, under the physical attributes is where you select your ambient engine sound. So just click on the blank area here, and it should bring you to your engine effects folder. under Federation, and this is where, like I said earlier in the tutorial, if you want to save any of your sound effects from the Bridge Commander model, this is where you can recycle them. So I've moved from a previous conversion a shuttlecraft sound effect into the engines for Federation, so we're going to use that one. If you haven't added anything obviously before, you're just going to have probably these two, which are large and medium, and they're designed for big ships. So click on the file that you want to use, open, save, and it'll automatically reload the model with our new sound. So you should be hearing the engine rumbling in the background. In my instance, it is the sound of the motion picture shuttle, which I'm pretty sure they recycled in the shows later on. Seems to be pretty canon to the sound of like the Type 6 and TNG and things like that. So it's pretty applicable. Again, sound is occlusive, so depending on how close you are to the object will affect the volume. Again, we're not going to be super close to shuttles. They're just going to be zipping around doing their thing. So we've generated shields. We've changed the hull strength or the hull integrity. So how much damage the hull can absorb after the shields or before the shields are raised, how much damage they can take. And we've selected a sound file. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is hardpoint some weapons. So this shuttle does have some basic defensive weapons, and they are located on the pylons. And they're pretty obvious. There they are. Because our ship isn't centered, we're going to have to hardpoint these ones individually, but that's a good lesson anyway. So go under your hardpoint properties, close your hardpoint file. Okay, so we'll start with the port side. I always start with one side and work my way to the other side. Obviously because you really only need, in essence, to do one side, even if there's a phaser strip here, a phaser strip here, there's one here, maybe there's one on the bottom left side of the ship and on the top left side of the ship. Once you're done hardpointing all of those strips, all you have to do is copy and paste and then remove the negative sign from all of the X coordinates, and it'll bump it over to your starboard or right side, and it'll duplicate them. They should be overlaid perfectly on your phaser strips, but that is completely dependent on the ship being centered again perfectly before you export it. So hardpointing is actually pretty easy. It is tedious when it comes to like galaxies and things like that, where you have to hardpoint a huge phaser arc that encompasses the whole, goes around the whole saucer section. It's a lot of clicking and adding and clicking and adding, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. So you want to go down to Weapons, Phasers, and select your first point. So this is a pretty basic phaser strip. We're just going to add 3 points. So the first point, we're going to start right there. So under phaser arrays, just click Add. So there's our new phaser array. So you can name this whatever you want. So Fed phaser is the default phaser. And you can name the phaser. So we're going to name this one Port because it's on the port side. So then under phaser points, just click phaser points, and it's going to bring up your coordinates dialog here. And this is for adding, removing, or moving around your coordinates points. So on the plus button here, we have a coordinate selected where we want to start. So there, click the plus, and it's going to bring that coordinate in. And it's simple. To carry on, just click your next point. So we want that somewhere in there, and click Add. And we're going to click the last point right about there, and click Add. And if you zoom in, you can see that it connects those dots with smaller dots, and that's just to represent that they are connected and that they're continuing on. So we're done. Save. So now we have a working phaser. But before we get too far, let's go ahead and do the other side. In this instance, we'll do the other side as an example. But if your model's set up right, you should be able to go along and hardpoint all of the one side of the ship and then just copy and paste and quickly edit in a notepad the X coordinates, and that'll duplicate all your stuff on there. But we know if we do that, our phaser strip is going to be, where will it be? It'll be way out here in space. It'll be off the side of the ship because the ship is centered to the left. So just go back to phaser arrays, add a new phaser. It doesn't matter where your marker is at the current when you create a new phaser, because it doesn't import any coordinates until you do so in the phaser point selection. So let's give this an ID. This is the script that this weapon is going to use, and fed phaser is the default. And we're going to rename this one starboard because it's the starboard phaser. Go under phaser points, and the same thing. So we're going to start here, add. I'm going to do this as good as I can because I'm actually going to keep this model. I'm not going to make any changes to it after this tutorial. So create your next point and add it. Select your next point and add it, and we're done. Save. Okay, so close. So let's load up a target. So you can load up anything you want. Like a, where are we here? The transport. So let's just load the transport. We'll select, unselect the use AI. We don't want it moving around. We want it to be stationary. We're already at red alert. If not, shift 3 to go to red alert, and that'll bring your weapons online. So they will take a minute to charge from initially going to red alert, because under the hardpoint properties, under the phasers, so here's our port and starboard array, we have things called minimum fire charge, recharge rate, and at the top, discharge rate. The discharge rate is how quickly the phaser will deplete its store of energy. The higher the number, the more quickly it goes through its energy. And the lower the number, obviously, the longer the phaser will fire. The amount of damage that the phaser actually does isn't affected by any of these numbers. It's actually done in a script. So the fed phaser script actually, and it points to another script which contains the damage amount. It's a pretty uniform number for most of the phasers. And we'll get into creating our own scripts later for weapons, and I'll explain that in just a second here. So the discharge rate, we want it to discharge pretty quickly. It's a shuttlecraft. It's not going to have a huge phaser reserve, obviously. So 2 is a pretty good number. A pretty low number. We want to bump that up to, let's say, 5. The minimum fire charge. So basically the energy reserve has to charge, the energy stores has to charge to a level of 80. And I don't know what that is in relation to. It just seems to be an arbitrary number. So the lower the number, the sooner the weapon can fire. But the downside to that is, like, I can set this to 5. And so I'm going to be able to shoot my phaser really quickly after it's done shooting the first time. But because the recharge rate is set fairly low, I'm only going to store up a small amount of energy between each phaser shot. It's important to note, too, in the hardpoint editor, there goes our phaser. So we were just at the wrong rotation. There it goes again. It's important to note that if your phaser strips, when you move them by copying and pasting, if they are hidden, so let's just go here and select our starboard phaser array, you can see each individual point. If you can't see those points, the phaser probably won't fire properly. This does have array intersect design into it, where if it detects that the phaser is going to penetrate through any part of the model. So for instance, if there was a ship over here, this phaser isn't going to fire because it knows it can't shoot through the model, and obviously, or through here or through here. It has to be in an area that is exposed openly to this array. So if this array is buried under the mesh, it's basically not going to work at all. So you have to make sure that your phasers are viewable. So for the most part, our phaser works, but as you can see, I'm trying to fire it and it's not working. Why is that? Well, that's because we're not allowing enough time for the generally slow or relatively slow recharge rate of the phaser. So let's go into the starboard phaser. So we set the minimum charge, fire charge, to a pretty low number, which allows us to fire quickly. But the recharge rate doesn't reflect reflect a very effective usage here. So we can sit here and try and fire all day long, and it's never actually going to accumulate to a actual phaser because it just doesn't have the required power. So the minimum fire charge, we're going to just bump that up to, we'll say 20. So the phaser has to charge to a minimum of 20 before it can discharge again. So even though it may not be fully charged, so this could be a percentage actually. So 20%, if it charges to 20%, we can fire. But again, it's only going to have 20% of energy to discharge, so it's only going to last a short while. So we'll save that. And it's going to take a minute for the weapons to charge up to a minimum of 20%. And when they do, we'll be able to fire. So let's just bring it into where the weapons are going to fire here. We're obviously going to have to tweak these phasers a bit. So there we go. So it just fired. And let's try and fire again. So it's not working because we're not allowing enough time for it to recharge. So that's pretty realistic, right? You don't want your phasers just going bananas. Obviously on a shuttlecraft, it's going to have pretty limited resources for weapons. It's not an offensive craft. But obviously we're going to have to tweak these phaser strips just a little bit. So let's open up our hardpoint file. And phasers, no matter when you add them, will always be at the bottom of the list. And torpedoes will always be at the very bottom of the list. Your navigation lights will generally stay at the top. It seems to organize these in the way that they're laid out in the hardpoint properties here. So from top to bottom is pretty much the way your file is going to be organized. So if we go here, I want to bump these phaser points out a little bit because I think there's a little bit of interference going on with the model. So really quickly, we'll just go here. Doesn't take much to make a big change. So let's just go 38.0. And we'll go so that made a difference of close to 0.2. So we'll just go 0.9 and 0.8. And we'll do the same down here. So increase it by 0.2, so to 6, to 8, and to 8. Save that. Close it. And reload our shuttle. So now if we zoom in, bring the sun around here, open up our hardpoint properties, select the phaser, so the starboard one in this instance, and it's hard to tell, but it's going to be there. You can kind of see it. It's actually protruding out from the model a little bit. So what that's going to allow us to do is this phaser, which on a high quality or a high poly model, that phaser will actually be modeled, so it'll actually protrude from the ship. So we'll actually get some coverage on more lateral angles, so going out this direction and going out this direction without intersecting the nacelle. So let's see if that made an improvement. So we obviously need to bring our weapons online, and we should be in a good firing position. Sweet. There we go. So even on a more oblique angle, the weapon's still fired pretty good. So let's just move our view around here so we can see what we're shooting at. So while the phasers are recharging, we can fire it again, but it's only going to fire the amount of energy that it's stored in the time that we allowed it to recharge. So see how short that phaser burst was, and I'm clicking away here and nothing's happening. So it's not going to happen until we get that 20% of power. And there it is. If we let it recharge a little bit longer, so we'll just let it sit there and recharge for a minute, it's going to allow us to fire for a little bit longer, which is going to inflict more damage. See? So as you can see, the basic Federation phaser script is pretty low powered. Like, we're hitting this transport and it's only dropped to 96% of its hull. So we'll get into script creation and editing here in a minute. So let's just pretend that this shuttle has a torpedo launcher. We know that it doesn't, at least not the basic model. But let's just pretend, move the sun around here to somewhere we can see. Let's pretend that this little deflector dish is actually a torpedo launcher. So on your ship you'll probably have modeled or at least textured areas that you will recognize as the torpedo tubes. So in this instance, for torpedoes and for pulse weapons, you want to select the area that you want to create the weapon in first. So make sure you select that spot. So we're going to go dead center of the deflector dish. Then we're going to go to torpedo launchers and we're going to click add. So by adding a new torpedo launchers, it's actually taken those coordinates and automatically inputted them, so we don't have to input them. So we don't have to make any modifications to that. But what we do want to make note of is the direction. If this was an aft torpedo tube, we would need in degrees 180 degrees, because we want the torpedoes to be able to fire in a reverse direction. The fire rate is how quickly the torpedoes will fire apart from each other. The FX script we need to put in, and that's fed photon, because that's the basic, that's the default photon torpedo script. And the script contains the color and speed and damage amount of the torpedo, and again we'll go into that later. We can rename it. If you've got a whole whack of them, you might want to be able to differentiate which ones are which for later on. We'll just name this one forward because there's only one of them. Don't modify the payload here. It won't save it no matter what you do. The reload time, so in seconds, how long it takes to reload the next batch of torpedoes. So for this one it's 30 seconds. And under slots is how many torpedoes are that you can fire in sequence. So basically we know a shuttlecraft with one torpedo tube or a larger craft that has multiple torpedo tubes will be able to fire a different amount of subsequent torpedoes. So this one, just for education purposes here, we'll go with 2. And the fire rate is set to 1 second. So we're only going to be able to fire these torpedoes 1 second apart. The lower the number, the quicker you're going to be able to fire them. So that's torpedoes. Let's go back into the hardpoint properties. And we're going to add some pulse weapons. Again, that's not canon or even realistic, but just so you know what you're doing. For instance, the Defiant class has pulse weapons, but I also use the pulse weapon script for using quantum torpedoes on ships like the Sovereign class. So with the hardpoint properties open, click a spot where you want your pulse weapon to fire from. So for this case, we're going to start with the port nacelle. We're just going to pretend that there's a pulse emitter on the tip of the nacelle here. And go to Pulse Weapons and click Add. So it's already added the position here, same as the torpedoes, based on where we had that marker set when we added it. So the direction we want 0. The fire rate, we're going to really knock this down, so 0.1, because we know that pulse phasers fire pretty rapidly. Okay, so then go to Fed script, and the default script for Federation pulse phasers is Fed pulse. And we can call this one port because it's on the left side. So how many pulses is it going to fire? 5, that's pretty realistic. And the reload time, 30 seconds, that's ridiculous. Let's make it 10 seconds. You know what, let's make it 5 just for the tutorial's sake. Obviously, it's going to be dependent on what you think the ship is capable of doing. If it can reload the pulse phasers rapidly, then a low number. If it's a smaller craft with lower power reserves, obviously a higher number is more realistic. So there we go. And we're going to create one on the right side. So let's just bring the sun around here so we can knock this right in the middle. So that's pretty much the middle of the port starboard nacelle. go back into your pulse weapons, under the pulse weapons option, and click add. And there's our second one. So we want to make it all the same. So fed pulse. And we're going to name this one starboard. So 5 pulses and 5 seconds apart, or 5 seconds to reload. The pulses are going to be 0.1 second apart. So that's going to give us a pretty rapid fire ability here. So close that. So that's the end of this tutorial. And in the next tutorial, I'm going to go over some script creation. As you can see, the phasers they look a bit silly on this. The phaser beam itself is too big, and the light point that it creates and the light point that it creates when it hits a ship are way oversized. See, the beam is basically half the width of the ship, and this light point, poor fellas, is way oversized, so it needs to be dropped down. The only way to do that is to create your own weapon script, and I'll get into that in the next tutorial. So stay tuned for tutorial 5, or hardpointing part 2.